nau mai ki tēnei hui mō te Herenga, Rīpotia nā take panoni āhuarangi. Thanks for logging into this session on reporting on climate change risk. Before starting out, I just want to confirm that we'll be holding similar sessions for private sector organisations shortly. I'll send out a notice via our networks, but also feel free to email me for more information about that. Now, to start off, I want to introduce my fellow panelists. Donovan Burton, an icon in climate change governance and reporting. He's a New Zealander, but he does a lot of work in Australia and Asia and the Pacific, working with organisations like UNESCO and governments at national and subnational level. Ian Edwards is an expert on the financial implications of climate change. He has a long history with insurers and working out of Zurich. He's an academic, a chartered accountant, and of course, because he lives in coastal southeast Queensland and an avid surfer. My name is Mark Baker-Jones. I'm the climate change practice lead at Simpson Grierson Lawyers, and I had the professional and personal privilege of spending a year with the Minister for Climate Change, Honourable James Shaw, on the precinct in Wellington as the Minister's advisor at the time the Zero Carbon Bill was being developed. So I feel sort of intimately connected with the Act, and by intimately I do mean many, many late nights going over it and the negotiations to get it through, including on the disclosure requirements, which we're going to talk about today. So what are we going to cover in this session? I'll speak about the why, the legal imperative, what the law says you need to do, and what you need to consider when you're responding to climate change and when you're making decisions about responding to climate change. And then Ian will speak about the when. He'll talk about the risk as we transition towards 2050, and he'll focus on the financial imperatives. And both Ian and I are really telling a story about why you need to be responding to and reporting on climate change. And then Donovan will speak about the what and the how, and he'll talk about how to develop that strong governance within your organisation, and he'll tell you how to do it. So let's begin the session. This session is all about reporting on climate-related risk by local authorities and council-controlled organisations and Crown entities and Lifeline utilities. And by Lifeline utilities, we mean public and private sector entities, so providing fuel and electricity and water, transport, telecommunications infrastructure, etc. And I'll refer to them collectively as reporting organisations. That's what they're referred to under the legislation. So you'll know that the Minister for Climate Change and the Climate Change Commission have the power to require those reporting organisations to provide information about their governance, their risks, their risk management, and the metrics and targets that they're using to respond to climate change. These are TCFD themes, and Ian will talk more about this. The purpose of this seminar is really to give you some things to think about as the power begins to be exercised and your organisations begin to be asked to report, because there's quite a lot to it, and you really need to be prepared across your organisation in order to respond appropriately. And you can expect the Minister to start requesting that information soon. MFE had indicated that request will start about now, near the end of this month. So why would you be talking to a lawyer about this? Well, if you think about it, your organisation's exposed to climate-related risk. Every organisation is to some degree. You're being asked to make a statement to the government, and you will inevitably be asked to make a similar statement to your stakeholders about how you're managing that risk. And if you aren't managing it, this will be apparent, and your organisation will be exposing its decision makers to challenges for not addressing the risk or not addressing it appropriately. And we know this because legal challenges have already been made overseas, and they're starting to be made here. There are a couple of things to get our heads around before we dive into the discussion. The first is about governance and accountability. We know that good governance and accountability will be crucial in developing Aotearoa New Zealand's response to climate change. And we've seen the policies that have been developed over this term of government around this. But also, good governance and accountability will be crucial in developing each and every one of your organisation's response to climate change. And in law, we think of governance in terms of our decisions. So it's about decision making. And good governance means your organisation makes informed, sound and robust decisions. And when we talk about accountability, understanding accountability will be crucial, because decision makers are being asked to explain and to justify and to take responsibility for their climate-related decisions. So governance and accountability is crucial. but also you need to understand what climate-related risk means, what they are, and we'll talk about that through the session. So if you are a reporting organisation, so a local government decision maker, or if you're a Lifeline utility decision maker, then to respond to climate change, you need good governance in your organisation that feeds information through to you as a decision maker. And as an organisation, you need to be accountable, to take responsibility and be able to explain your decision. And that's the basis for reporting on climate change. It's behind a requirement or a request to report on climate-related risk to ensure accountability for decisions. So my message to decision makers of those organisations is that you need to make sure you're getting the right information from your organisation and that you're making the best decisions, because you will be held accountable. So a brief overview of reporting and how it fits in the broader climate change policy regime. New Zealand's first national climate change risk assessment's been completed. You would have seen the work from MFE and ACOM and James Hughes and his team from Tonkin and Taylor. That risk assessment is designed to inform the National Adaptation Plan. So the National Adaptation Plan is the government's key vehicle to set out an all-of-government response to the risks identified in the risk assessment. And some of you will be aware that the Zero Carbon Act amendments to the Climate Change Response Act requires government to release the National Adaptation Plan within 2 years of publication of the risk assessment. But just be aware that the government's not going to wait 2 years before it starts releasing the plan. It'll likely release initiatives under the plan as they're developed. So a couple of points. The first about the National Risk Assessment, it focuses on the physical impacts of climate change, but be aware that successive national risk assessments will bring in other risks, the transition risks, and Donovan and I will all speak about the transition risk. The second point is the significance of Aotearoa New Zealand having an emissions reduction target. Now, if we didn't have that target, we might only be talking about the physical risk, but because we have a global target in the Paris Agreement and our domestic target, there's a risk to our global and domestic financial stability as we try to decarbonize the global and the domestic economy. And I won't go into this now, but Ian will talk a little bit about this. But just bear in mind that it's fundamental to why nations are acting on climate change. So having a domestic emissions reduction target is something very important, although it's not unique to New Zealand. And actually we have several targets, but the two most important ones are our temperature target, which requires us to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and then our emissions reduction target, which requires us to get to net zero emissions by 2050. That 2050 net zero target is important because it sets a trajectory which, if we're going to meet it, means we have to decarbonize our economy. We have to remove or drastically reduce carbon emissions and emissions of carbon equivalent gases from our economy. We have to remove our reliance on fossil fuels for energy and heat and transport, and our methane emissions and our nitrous oxide emissions. So Ian will talk about this, but just understand that a significant amount of our investment, if not all, has to move away from fossil fuels and carbon equivalent emitting industry. And it's why we continue to see news like this week where a $90 billion Nordic hedge fund has dumped all its oil stocks, or BP announcing that it is slashing oil and gas production by 40%, and Shell announcing that it's building a vast wind farm off the coast of the Netherlands. Now you might think, well, we don't have any coal-fired power plants or petroleum processing plants or milk drying plants in our community, but you do have large parts of your community that are dependent on fossil fuel heating or energy or transport or agriculture, and that all has to change by 2050. And it's not at 2050, it's starting now and leading into 2050. So by 2050, we have to have a net zero, low carbon economy, and that's only 30 years from now. And local authorities are already planning for that period. And just bear in mind, this is not a New Zealand only journey. The entire global economy has already begun that journey. We're just a little behind on some of this. And the third thing, and I touched on this before, is that every sector of the economy faces a degree of change in the effort to decarbonize the economy, and every sector would face a degree of disruption and cost if we didn't do it. And the difference is that it will cost more if we don't act. There was a report that came out this week, and it stated that the economic losses from climate-linked extreme weather in the US alone has cost at least $1.77 trillion. And there was a report earlier this year that said that the global economic cost is estimated to be $1.2 trillion per year when we don't act. And if you compare this with an estimate of what it will cost to do something, an initial 0.5% reduction in GDP growth. So still high economic growth. And it estimated that action will result in global 26 trillion direct economic gain to 2030. So for businesses or industry that is bemoaning the cost of change or the pace of change, you can be certain the cost of not responding will be much higher for the whole economy, and much higher for local governments who are sort of the coalface of climate change. And also remember that by not responding, you miss out on those opportunities. They go elsewhere. Now, a quick word on risk to follow that. It's important to consider the physical impacts of climate change, but those impacts only really become important when they pose a risk. And what I mean is, for example, flooding is only an issue if it poses a risk to, say, infrastructure or housing or urapa or to life. But if it means, say, that a waterfall somewhere in the bush floods, then unless it causes a risk to property or life, then it's probably not a concern. And the point is that it's not just about impacts, but it's also about risk. An impact alone may not pose a risk. Now, councils around the country are at very different stages in terms of assessing and managing their climate change risks, or even identifying them. And while many are looking at, say, flooding or sea level rise, they may not be managing those other risks. So it's probably going to be difficult for you to find a policy response in your organisation that addresses something like the decreasing viability of certain primary industries in your community because of climate change, that local economic impact. But that's a major risk. And for example, Landcorp announced last week that it was shifting from animal protein business to crops and forestry and horticulture as climate change pressures grows. So these are the things to be watching. And something that touches on what Ian will speak about is, do you have a policy on assessing how you're going to finance your organization's transition to net zero? Now, have you thought about what decisions private and public funders are going to make in light of the need to transition? Where are they going to invest? Not in carbon, unless it's sequestration or reductions. But if you haven't, you're not alone. Councils have yet to engage with their constituents on the range of risks that climate change will pose to their regions in the future, and many are still just looking at the physical impacts. So they're really just sort of babies in this journey, be it a risky one. And I hope that by the end of the session, you'll be thinking about what is at the moment largely a forgotten risk, but is a very important risk, and that is a risk associated with making that transition to net zero by 2050. The other thing is that as many local authorities have not really started planning for climate change, there's also very little certainty at the local level as to what the policy response should be to those risks. And that's a whole different session in itself, but something we've been working on with a number of councils, so I'm happy to talk about that at some time. But what this means is that decision makers in your organisation probably aren't nearly as well as informed as they should be to make climate related decisions, and certainly not ones that align with your organisation's risk appetite. So legal obligations. The key thing from my perspective is that you understand how you're going to respond to your legal obligations. The obligations themselves are fairly common across organisations that have a public function. But if you add in that element of legal risk, which is something different, obligations versus risk, it can become quite complicated. And the risk is about the ability or the willingness of your organisation to respond to the obligation. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but the Climate Change Response Act allows decision makers to consider the 2050 target. But it's very important for your organisation to understand what that section actually means for you, particularly in light of obligations under the RMA and LGA, and particularly in light of that growing body of case law. So you need to check that out, it's very important. Where the Minister's power lies and the Climate Change Commission's power lies on reporting, it's in Section 5ZW of the Climate Change Response Act. And that provision gives the Minister and the Commission the power to require over 600 reporting organisations, so most of you who are watching this, the power to require you to report on the climate risk and your response to that risk. So at this point, and again, this is very important, one, there's an obligation in certain cases to take the target, etc., and I'll say climate change into account. And then coupled with that is an obligation to report on how you're doing that, how you're taking it into account. And so if you remember back to when I said at the beginning, governance and accountability, the legal risk arises where you fail to do either or you fail to do them properly. And at the moment as a lawyer, I'm seeing lots of risks not being managed, not being mitigated. And what engagement with local government has highlighted is that there are systemic issues which are hindering them from proactively responding to climate change. And coupled with that is the fact that local governments face a range of issues when taking action to reduce climate risk. And these include risk management decisions are often delegated to individuals in the council, and this can create issues if decision makers don't have reliable access to up-to-date information, or those sort of decisions like managed retreat, for example, sometimes are just too hard at that individual's level. Other issues are that there's a bias towards recovery and response action after an event rather than proactive risk reduction and management. And we know that early climate-related risk reduction and preparedness can minimize costs and risks in the long run. Other organizations just don't have appropriate policy in place to get the information through to decision makers. That's probably the biggest issue. So this just increases the legal risk, where there's a failure in terms of internal reporting, and that leads to a legal risk when it comes to making the external disclosure. And the evidence for this is being seen in the increasing number of court actions being taken against decision makers. So internationally, in New Zealand, there's been at least 1,200 climate change court cases. I actually think there's probably a lot more than that. Many of those involve government. Australia has had over 100 or nearly 100 climate change related court actions to date, most against local authorities. And there's a smaller number in New Zealand, but it's growing. And there are lots of cases about council decisions to approve development on land that's potentially exposed to climate change impacts like flooding or coastal inundation. And similarly, there are lots of cases where action has been taken against local authority for failing to respond appropriately to climate change. And one of these is the Kapiti Coast District Council decision, and many of you will be aware of this. And I mention it because I was asked about this after the session on Tuesday. But very briefly, the case was a dispute between ratepayers and the council, and the council had put a notice on some LINs, on the Land Information Memorandum, about 1,800 of them, that the land was at risk from erosion, and a ratepayer challenged the council's decision to do this, to put that notice on the LIN in the High Court. And the court focused on two issues. The first was whether the council was obliged to include information on the LINs, and the second, if it was, whether the method used to display them was proportionate. Now, on the first point, the obligation point, the court found, that absolutely some reference to the information needed to be included on the LINs. And the court said that the purpose of a LIN was to inform and, if necessary, to warn potential purchasers about all the relevant features of the land. And that purpose included trying to warn the market about the potential local effects of the global phenomenon, climate change. What the court was critical of was the second point, and that was that without adequate explanation of the inherent assumptions or methodology, the information could be misleading and inappropriate. So if you just think about that, the court is really saying, firstly, that if the council has information about these types of impacts, that it should be on the LIN, and secondly, that it has to be transparent about the information. So what I'm saying, don't look at Kapiti and say, well, we just ignore the risk, because Kapiti is not saying that. It's saying the opposite. It's saying, well, you need to understand your climate-related risk, and you need to disclose it appropriately. And this is what the session is about, understanding and appropriately disclosing climate-related risk. Now, just a point, Donovan and I have had experience in Australia with a couple of councils that took the view that they wouldn't look at their risks, that they would just do nothing and assume bliss in their ignorance. Now, Australia's grappled with some of these issues quite a while ago, so we're able to learn from their mistakes. Those councils that willfully blinkered themselves from these risks have been rewarded with substantial subsequent issues, and they've been forced to contend with those risks later, but at a far greater cost than if they had addressed them earlier. And we see it here in some of our primary sectors that if you ignore those issues, if you sort of dig yourself into a hole and it gets deeper, the longer you ignore it, until the costs sort of get out of that hole are debilitating. And another thing we're seeing in the litigation is a change in the nature of those cases. We used to see cases mostly about not managing the physical impacts, not putting in seawalls, for example. But cases more recently are ones about the manner in which climate change related policies are administered or statutory compliance and the duties owed. And we see that issue being considered in a New Zealand case at the moment, a climate change duty. But we're also seeing an increase in disclosure cases, disclosure of climate related risk. And these cases represent the types of actions that are likely to be taken more and more against governments, including at local level, that fail to address and appropriately disclose those climate related risks. So I won't go on, but there are some key things to look out for, as a reporting organisation that's subject to a disclosure requirement, things to help you mitigate your legal risk. And these lessons come from, not only climate-related cases, but just common, general common interpretation of duties to disclose. So firstly, ensure compliance with statutory obligations on climate change. They may not always be clear, and because they may not be clear, it increases the risk as stakeholders resort to the courts for clarification. So understand your legal obligations. Have robust procedural frameworks in place. They're critical to minimize the risk of challenges to decisions. So make sure you have those procedures in place. Have a policy mandating this and stick to it. Make sure your decision makers are up to the task. You either need to demonstrate that the decision-making body or the committees, or even it's an individual making the decisions, that they have the necessary skills and expertise in climate change, or that they're being reported to by people who do. Don't be afraid to link climate-related performance and remuneration. Reward good risk awareness and mitigation. Link up climate-related risks and opportunities with the organisation's strategic and organisational response. Don't just deal with the physical impacts and think you're done. We're in a transitioning world. Our global and domestic economies are transitioning. Our laws are transitioning. Our financial institutions are transitioning. So make sure your organisation understands, what its transition risk is and the costs and implications. On reporting, be sure not to make misleading disclosure. When you're making disclosure about climate risk, make sure it's true, it's accurate, it's to the best of your abilities. This can be challenging when the organisation has to state that it doesn't actually understand its risk or it's not doing much about it. But better to do that than to say something else and be challenged on it, because there will be informal auditing. Information will be released from other organisations that will reveal a lot about your organisation. So it could be a significant risk. Make sure you disclose everything that's material. Again, there's a lot to talk about when you talk about materiality, but if it's likely to be decision useful, then it needs to be disclosed. And don't just give a boilerplate response. You need to tailor your response to suit the risk, and be aware that this will change over time. Physical impacts will increase. There'll be changes in investment decisions. The price of carbon will rise. New policy and regulatory changes will occur. And this will change your exposure and the nature of the transition risk. So, your reporting will need to change as well. Don't omit irrelevant information. Don't understate the risk. Don't misstate it. Don't be selective and overly optimistic in your assessment of the risk. And be consistent across the organisation on how you assess that risk. And finally, make sure you have policies and procedures in place that allow and ensure that the right information gets through to decision makers. But if you do all that, you'll be well on the path to mitigating your risk. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Ian to talk about the financials. Ian.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Hello, everyone. Just confirm for me, Mark, I'm just bringing up the presentation and I've got the right screen there. How's that looking?
No, I can't see it yet.
Oh, hold on a second. There we go. How's that?
Yep, that's good.
Great, thank you. Okay, today I'd like to discuss with you the financial implications of climate risk. As Mark mentioned, amongst for many years, climate change was framed as an environmental risk, which sort of created this false assumption that it existed far removed from any financial implication. This, of course, couldn't be further from the truth. The direct physical impacts of the likes of extreme weather are well documented. Storm surges, cyclones, bushfires damage property and infrastructure, rendering them either inoperable or in need of repair, with obvious financial implications both for asset owner and, where relevant, servant recipient. Whilst much of the damages incurred were for a long time rightly attributed to settlement patterns and increases in wealth, a distinct climate signal of late has emerged. So, for example, it's been calculated that the extensive damage inflicted in New York from the storm surge from Superstorm Sandy in 2012 was increased by 30% due to higher sea levels, which were attributed to global warming. Now, given seas around New York have only risen around 20 centimetres since pre-industrial times, it's pretty obvious that it doesn't take much to tip things over the edge with pretty significant ramifications. The impacts of extreme events don't always have to be directly felt, however, to have those ramifications. So take Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E as it's known. So PG&E is California's biggest electricity utility. And you may not be aware of this, but the average annual temperature in California is already almost 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, this is the upper end of the Paris Agreement target. Of late, California is not only hotter, but also drier. These conditions, when combined, have contributed to an increase in the number of California's wildfires, as we're seeing right now. I'm sure you're aware, August 21st, Governor Newsom of California actually declared a state of emergency around the wildfires in California right now. And these wildfire events have actually increased fivefold since the 1970s. So, okay, what's this got to do with PG&E? Well, the brushing of PG&E power lines against parched vegetation were found to have sparked the Kincaid and Camp fires, amongst others. Now, these fires decimated lives and property in California in 2018 and 2019. You may recall the town of Paradise almost being wiped out. PG&E were held responsible for starting these fires because they had failed to maintain equipment in accordance with what is essentially a new California normal: hot, dry, and at times windy weather, all elements of wildfire environments. So in 2019, PG&E filed for bankruptcy under the weight of $30 billion in legal action brought in lieu of damages incurred. PG&E is widely considered to be the first company to file for bankruptcy due to climate change. Now, the financial implications didn't only rest with PG&E as a company. Shareholders saw around $20 billion wiped from the value of their shares overnight. And since electricity rates have gone up as PG&E looks to recoup costs, insurance coverage for other utilities has evaporated. They've been tarred with the same brush as PG&E. Now, the PG&E story continues today. They're working their way out of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But it's interesting to note that blackouts, which were rolled out by PG&E on high-risk days to prevent potential sparks, has meant that small businesses were unable to operate. So as an example, in 2 days, last October, when these blackouts were rolled out, small business wrote off $2.5 billion in revenues and in additional costs. Now, these examples highlight an important point. The physical impacts of climate change are not always direct, but may cascade along supply chains and other interdependencies. Now, unfortunately, as Mark noted, this isn't where it all ends. I've provided some examples to get you thinking about the paths along which financial impacts can arise from actual physical events or trends such as sea level rise. The other path, and given the recent enactment of the Zero Carbon Act, one that is potentially even more prescient to this audience, is the risks that arise as society both reacts in response to and in anticipation of climate change. These risks arise as countries transition, as New Zealand has pledged to do by 2050, to net zero carbon economies. Transition risk, as it's termed, is illustrated in a common concern amongst the world's financial regulators, including your own Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Regulators worry that the exposure of the financial sector to high emitting industries such as coal mines and gas-fired power stations could expose markets to sudden downward corrections as carbon intensive assets fall from grace. Any rapid drop in value could destabilise global financial markets, with, as we saw in the global financial crisis, negative implications for many of us. To prevent this, regulators assert that the transition must be managed and orderly. Now, as Mark mentioned, carbon-intensive power plants and mines are of minor relevance to New Zealand, but zero is zero, and regardless of quantity, any emissions will attract one form of financial punishment or another. And as noted, managing a transition is just that. It's not a last-minute activity exposing organisations to rushed decisions. And this is especially the case for infrastructure, where, dependent on the nature of the infrastructure, expectations of service life may well exceed 2050, the net zero deadline. Thus, inappropriate decisions made now could lock asset providers into expensive retrofits further down the line, or even result in infrastructure unwanted by society and thus stranded, just like this poor little barrel of oil before you right now. So whilst transition risk strictly refers to changes that arise as society reduces its emissions, risks also arise to consumers as the financial sector reduces its exposure to climate risks. So Mark mentioned the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or the TCFD. Now, it's no mistake that the target of the TCFD is the financial sector. Not only is management of risk a key function of the sector, thus a good place to introduce a novel risk like climate risk, but its pivotal position within economies means that for it to effectively manage risk, those with whom it transacts must do the same. Because while it might be a little simplistic to say so, the climate risk borne by the financial sector reflects the climate risk of the organisation it insures and it lends to. Indeed, a central premise of the architects of the TCFD is that disclosure of climate risk enables the market to price that risk. Companies and assets, all other things equal, deemed to have greater exposure to climate risk will be punished with lower valuations and share prices. Conversely, consumers with greater climate risk will have to pay greater interest on loans or higher insurance premiums. Importantly, those additional costs are generated not by actual impact, but by expectation of impact, risk. Now, you might think this is airy-fairy stuff and a million years away, but the reality is this is already happening. So insurance affordability is a big issue for North Queensland, north of where I come from. A spate of tropical cyclones and storms up to 2012 saw insurance premiums rise in some circumstances at that time by 1,000%. This is consistent with wildfire insurance in California, where after the fires I noted earlier, an estimated 350,000 Californian homes and business owners are unable to get property and casualty insurance. Climate change represents a great concern to the insurance industry. And as an example, Ernst Rauch, who's a senior climatologist of Munich Re, which is the world's biggest reinsurer, and reinsurers are companies that insure insurers, has stated that the sector is concerned that continuing global increases in temperature could make it increasingly difficult to offer the affordable financial protection that people deserve and that modern society requires to function properly. I mean, that's insurance speak for, we're worried that we'll be able to offer our product at a price that people can pay for it. A number of studies in the US have actually explored the impact of climate change on cost of debt for municipalities, so for example, local governments, councils in the US, and have found that those with greater exposure to climate risks are paying more than those that aren't. As an example, a study by Painter in 2019 compared the issuance costs of long-dated municipality bonds and found that on average, a rise of 1% climate risk equated to an increase in annualised issuance costs of 23 basis points. Now that's about 0.23%. Now, that might not sound a lot, but it equates to approximately $1.7 million in annualised issuance costs for the average county. And another study by Bernstein, the one that I've got up on the screen here, the results of which were also released in 2019, compared sales data of properties exposed to sea level rise against all other things being equal, properties not exposed. Now, this study was based on the US's largest real estate database, which contains around 374 million sales transactions. So it's quite an extensive study. It found that in 2007, which was the start of the sample, there was no difference in price. But by 2016, which was the end of the sample, exposed properties attracted on average a price 7% lower than unexposed. And where the property was purchased for investment purposes, as in take all the emotional elements of property out of it, the discount blew out to 13.5%. Now, thankfully, the story doesn't end there. Studies have also indicated evidence of municipality management of climate risk can offset any additional costs due to exposure. Thus, managing climate risk not only reduces the risk itself, but has flow-on effects for how much you pay to access finance. Now, increasing pressure from investors such as the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and regulators such as the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and emergent legal obligation for governing bodies to appropriately manage climate risk is casting a higher and more focus on climate risk management in New Zealand as it is in much of the rest of the world. And the advent of the TCFD is the icing on the cake, because it's the TCFD that provides the mechanism by which entities can disclose their exposure to and management of climate risk. But it also provides the mechanisms by which entities can see how another entity is managing their climate risk. It exposes good practice and it exposes bad. And as this framework matures, it's pretty likely that there will be increasingly nowhere to hide from this. Okay, so for the councils on the call, I'd like you to consider what the impact on services would be should you have to pay higher interest on your loans. Or what about higher premiums for insurance? And what would it mean for revenues if your ratings pool decreased due to broad property devaluations? Consider further what this might mean should it occur at the same time as increasing repairs and running costs or reduced operational life of your assets. Or due to added degradation, you had to increase asset depreciation rates in accordance with accounting standards in your books. And just to throw in another one, what about if businesses keen to embrace the future move to jurisdictions keen to do the same? Now, my intention in this presentation, hasn't been to scare the pants off you, but what I've illustrated today are the sorts of challenges that climate change represents. It's not all doom and gloom, however. There is strong recognition within the insurance industry, as an example, and certainly amongst disaster risk management practitioners. But money spent on prevention today pays itself back in multiples in the future. And financial products are rapidly evolving to support both a net zero and climate resilient economy. And as with any risk, the sooner it is understood, the sooner and more effectively it can be managed. It's all about getting started. The opportunities are all there. It's just a matter of taking to the road. So now I'll pass the baton to Donovan, who will discuss considerations that could enable you to do just that.
Great, thank you, Ian. Just bear with me a moment. I will share my screen. Apologies there. Excuse me. So thanks for that, Ian and Mark, and hello everyone. So following from what Ian said earlier, I'd just like to give an example of one of my local clients here in Australia. Now, last year, a small development area, a number of lots, was deemed to be at such a great risk from sea level rise that one of the major banks actually dropped the asset to loan ratio to 50%, which sent a significant signal to the market. Nobody purchased any of the lots. You could, no first home buyer was going to put 50% deposit down. And then, unfortunately, a few months later, because the location got impacted by the bushfires we had in January, the Valuer General said that the majority of the property in the municipality is going to drop considerably by about 15%. So that's quite significant. The council are concerned that the ratepayers will see on their rate bill that their value's gone down, but their rates stay the same. But council can't drop their rates any further because they need the resourcing. So ultimately, this is going to manifest as a political risk. So climate change was once classed as an emergent environmental risk, and as Ian rightly said, it's now actually considered and should be considered a current and financial one. And it's a risk that I think is going to catch some organisations off guard, especially in that transition-related risk space, just like the ones that he mentioned earlier. So without good governance and a good system for disclosure, I think some of the responses to climate change risk may actually be reactive and therefore cause a range of unwanted outcomes, as we call it maladaptation. And this is why disclosure combined with structured governance and clear communication, I think, is fundamental to building a low carbon resilient society. So let's look at disclosure. Well, some may see climate change disclosure as an onerous or over bureaucratic task. I think it's actually a great opportunity for an organisation. The types of information that the government will be asking of you is actually information that the organisation needs to know. They need to understand how climate change will affect them. So I suggest that the organisation should use these questions that emerge from the government as an initial gap analysis assessment and a catalyst for identifying future work. Remember, climate change disclosure enables the market and wider society the ability to better identify and respond to complex risks. And some of your key stakeholders will want to see how you're responding to climate-related risks. It might not be just the government, it also may be a credit rating agency or a lender. And also remember how one organisation responds to the effects of climate change can be either a risk multiplier or a resilience enabler for somebody else. Recently, I was at a TCFD meeting in Singapore, and one of the large ICT businesses stated that the failure of government to disclose risks and responses around a human settlement, so they weren't sure whether this city was going to have planned retreat or if they were going to stay and defend. The fact that the government wasn't disclosing that was actually hamstringing their strategic thinking. They wanted to know if there was going to be planned retreat, then perhaps they wouldn't put their $50 million worth of investment in that location straight away until they understood the response from the local government was going to be. So it makes a huge difference. It can be the difference between investing, for this example, in new communications technology in the area or not. So the initial information that I think Mark touched on that's going to be asked of you directly does align to the TCFD framework. So it starts off with governance, an organisation's governance in relation to the risks and opportunities, because there are opportunities, of course, arising from climate change, the actual and potential effects of those risks and opportunities on an organisation's business strategy and financial planning, the processes that the organisation uses to identify, assess and manage the risks, which can be challenging at times, and then of course metrics and targets that help the organisation to assess and manage those climate related risks and also track it over time. So let's look at governance. So this is an example of typical governance mechanisms that you would see in New Zealand. So you've got your long-term plan, for example, that drives your decision making and starts looking at where things are. So if we unpack this a little bit more, we can look at the long-term plan and the types of questions that may be asked of you. And it might be what assumptions have been used or that might be affected by physical risks. And as Ian talked about, what are the potential impacts on insurability, other things that you might want to be thinking about in terms of climate change if you're a local government or a Lifeline utility for that matter. How is settlement form going to change? How will climate change shape settlements into the future? What's the range of carbon prices that might emerge? It's really interesting. One of my clients here is a large utility, and they've just realised that they're exposed to a carbon target set by the state, and there is an interim target that they have to achieve by 2030. Now, I won't go into the details about why, but they actually need to be across this carbon management within the next 2 or 3 years. So for them, it's quite significant impact on their, a significant financial risk to them. And this is because it will take them a couple of years to sort of settle in to identify the power purchase agreements that they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So in the interim time, they will have to purchase offsets. And that would be an annual, at current prices, bill for them, somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. But if the price on carbon goes up, then it could go up to $1 million a year for them. So, this is actually a significant challenge. If we go to financial strategy and management, I think for the CFOs in the room, start thinking about impairment of assets, useful life of property, plant and equipment, changes to fair valuation of assets. This has been a significant problem in Australia. They're all trying to explore the risks of depreciation, and then the presentation of financial statements. And that is more and more the auditors are actually asking organisations. They're asking the organisations, excuse me, why have they got climate change on the risk register or why not? And they're asking them to justify that. So let's look at an example. So this is in Western Australia. We assessed 139 municipalities in WA, but we actually did it for about almost all local governments in Australia now, and the scores are pretty much the same. And so when you look at the strategic planning or the corporate plan, that's like compared to New Zealand, that's your long-term plan. Now, climate change was considered quite well in the long-term plans, but then when it shifts into the financial management, you actually see that it drops right down. And so there's a gap between why the financial management and there's a gap between why isn't it in the why is it in the corporate plan, but why isn't it in the financial management plan? And we saw the same thing happen with asset management plans as well. And so when you're looking at governance, the critical one there would be a climate change policy, because the climate change policy enables you to have the head of power and drive consistent and robust decision making. But a number of organisations don't actually have a climate change policy or a corporate standard. So that's really, really important to have. In terms of strategy, well, I would argue that a climate change strategy alone is not enough of a response to consideration of climate change within your organisation. So it needs to be embedded into your organisation. So let's look at strategy. Sorry about this. So when you're looking at strategy, often there's a range of climate change scenarios that you need to be thinking about. And so climate change it can be quite complex. There are more than 40 climate change emission scenarios. You've got a range of sensitivities. And so go back to that policy that I was talking about. You need to justify which climate change scenario you're choosing and why. It's really important to say that why. This example here for one of my clients, if you can look down on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, is they have the red line is where the climate change projections are, and the green line is actually how they're tracking against those projections. So they're actually almost at 2 degrees above historical events. And as Ian was saying, that's what they're seeing in California at the moment. And with your strategy, when you're thinking about your scenarios that you use for your strategic planning, think about something like this technology risk here, where you've got drones now being argued that they may be consume less energy per package kilometre than actually delivery trucks. And I don't think many long-term plans for municipalities actually show how drone technology may actually affect or change their long-term strategies. Risk management is a complex issue, and for risk management, it's about how do you identify, how do you assess, and how do you manage the risk. And so councils should be considering, are they looking at their own assets? And of course they should be, but also what is the broader risk to the the municipality. So it might be, what is the impact on the rate base, for example. Just remember that risk is a function of three elements. It's a hazard, your exposure to that hazard, and then the vulnerability to that should the hazard happen. Risk management should include processes that an organisation uses to assess this. So let's unpack that a little bit more. So let's start off with, what are you actually adapting to? What climate-related models have you chosen and why? And how is climate change included in your risk management framework? How do you apply a proxy likelihood to a level that might be actually quite difficult and is evolving rapidly? How do you update your flood maps, drought plans, heat wave assessments, etc.? For assessing the risks, you should be looking at the hazard, for example, the flood modelling, your exposure to that hazard. So look at how many properties, for example, in that hazard area, and the vulnerability to that hazard. So, for example, if you're like Brisbane and you have 60,000 properties exposed to a flood risk, then what does that actually mean? And is the organisation going to be able to gather the same rate base that they had anticipated earlier? And have a think about, you know, what governance mechanisms you are using. So for an example, a council in South Australia is actually exploring risk, the risk to their rate base from bushfires. And so they're actually exploring insurance products that may offset the bushfire risk when it happens, because they know they're not going to be able to generate the rates from those communities once the bushfire hits. And we see this actually in the example of WA once again. So, you know, risk management isn't actually embedded into the formal governance arrangements. So it's fundamental that it is. So whilst there might be a climate change risk assessment done, it hasn't actually been filtered right down into the actual organisational risk management framework. So let's move on to metrics and targets, because I think, you know, this is actually really important. Sometimes people get concerned about targets, especially public ones, because it's hard to separate the politics from performance. One of the hardest things for local governments to do is actually sign off on public targets, but you know, this is of course just a leadership issue. Now, what is not a target is a low carbon or resilient city. You know, you can't manage what you don't measure. So they actually need to be measurable targets. So for targets and metrics, I suggest that you start with the vital signs. So here's a machine that I know too well. You know, I've been the survivor of the wonders of the Australian venomous animals. And you look at this machine, well, doctors know what vital signs they want to measure over time. They have their pre-programmed responses that they'll use to keep them within the range that they want. But too often, these key metrics are not really accessible. So it delays the ability for organisations to respond to those key triggers. And depending on the issue, it may close the door to some effective treatments. A good example of that is I had one of my clients actually set a target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2022. It was a political target that was set, so they were really trying to do it well and truly ahead of time. They wanted to show that they were an early mover. The problem was, you know, they didn't have these targets and metrics shown around within the organisation. So you had the procurement team actually not knowing that there were any targets, so they were carrying on continuing to purchase fossil fuel machinery and fleet, and also the energy team actually didn't even know what their carbon footprint was as a base level. So it's really important that you have this communication process. Some of the ones that I think might be useful, you know, to look at exposure metrics, how many properties or homes are, you know, exposed to a flood risk, for example. I'm going to finish up in a minute, but I think it's really important to note that, you know, adaptation works, but it doesn't happen in isolation. So if you look at this example, this house here, the owner wanted to be resilient to storm surge and large flood events, And so what they did is they over-engineered their property to do so. But as you can see, they have no neighbours and there's no supporting infrastructure. So it's really important to consider it as a systems view. And just before I hand over back to Mark, I just wanted to say, just remember that disclosure does present the opportunities. Take those questions that will be sent to you shortly and use those to identify a pathway through all of this. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Donovan. Hey, we've got a couple of minutes left. Just from your experience, where do you think that climate change should sit within an organisation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's traditionally sat, within the Environment Office's location, and they traditionally haven't actually been listened to be honest. And I think at the end of the day, climate change is a corporate risk, and I think both you and Ian have stressed that quite significantly. It's a corporate risk, so it should sit within the corporate risk. Within the corporate risk team, of course they'll be asking questions of the environmental officer, but at the end of the day, I think it needs to sit in that organisational governance space.
It's sort of in the risk and audit team. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, risk and audit team, risk management, core governance. The different organisations have different versions of what that is, but it definitely needs to be a corporate risk. And a good example was a council that I worked with. When the CEO saw what the risks were, he took climate change out of that risk team and he took control of it himself. And he actually took the whole team, the environment team, and he put them into his own sort of corporate governance team, which I thought was a really, really interesting, interesting response to that.
Yeah, I've seen it happen a couple of times where the CFO is brought in as well. And it suddenly becomes a key consideration by council once the CFO understands that the financial impacts of climate change on the organisation. Yeah,
can I ask you a quick question coming back to you? So, yes. Where do you think, coming from New Zealand, this is really new. Where do you think the organisations should start? If you're a reporting organisation or deemed to be one, where do you start?
I think the key thing is you've got to go back to basics. You've got to understand what's required of you as an organisation, and it's not easy. But I think you start with understanding what your legal obligations are. It's not just reporting, your full obligation when it comes to climate change. So, what are your legal obligations? What does legislation say you should be doing? What do the courts have to say you should be doing about what you should be doing? And that includes your duties, particularly here in New Zealand, is your duties to Māori as well, Māori and iwi. And once you understand, where your obligations are, you run that risk lens over that, a legal risk lens. And it's not enough just to say, like the Act says, I can take climate change into account if I want to, because that's not going to enable you to manage your risks. And the courts have effectively said, in litigation that we've seen overseas, that the law is an open norm when it comes to climate change. So even if the legislation is not changing, the interpretation of those duties is. So get all that sorted first, and then get to understand your other climate-related risks, the work that you and Ian are doing. Identifying and assessing and managing those risks. Use the tools available to you, like the disclosure tool that you have. And then understand, the legal requirements for reporting. Make sure you're doing that correctly and you're not exposing yourself by reporting too little or, in some cases, too much. We might finish up there. We're just about running out of time. I just want to sum up on what I think are the 3 points that have come out of this session. The first one, good governance and good accountability is crucial. It's crucial in developing your organisation response to climate change. So this means having policies and procedures in place that support your decision makers. The decision makers will be accountable, so you've got to make sure those procedures and policies mitigate their risk. The second thing, that climate risk is a financial risk, and the earlier you start to manage that risk, the better and more effectively you'll be able to manage the financial impact. And the third point, Donovan, that you made, that you should use disclosure as a tool. Use disclosure as a tool to help identify and understand and manage those climate-related risks and move along that climate risk management pathway. Very good. Look, thanks very much. Feel free to contact any of us. Our contact details are on the invitations. Thanks, Donovan. Thanks, Ian. Thanks to everyone that joined.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.